Hi everyone, this is John. Welcome back to another episode of our weekly show, The Subcontinent. Our program aims to address important issues in the subcontinent which affect the governments, people, organizations, and the region as a whole. We will try to explain the issues, break down controversies surrounding them, and try to have some external perspectives from experts and people.
In this edition of The Subcontinent, we will discuss Daesh and Takfirism in Afghanistan. And we shall also look at how the United States is involved in the rise of the Takfiri terrorist group in the country.
While the people of Afghanistan seek to wash the country of decades of war, a looming menace is revealing itself: Daesh, also known as ISIL or ISIS. The number of terrorist attacks in Afghanistan has been increasing despite the ongoing talks between the US, Taliban, and Afghan authorities. But the rise in the frequency of assaults by Daesh Takfiris is something new and alarming.
Week after week, Afghanistan, especially the capital Kabul, is the scene of bloody terrorist attacks. Many people expected that such attacks would happen less often given the talks and agreements between Taliban and the United States and the Afghan administration. But reports prove an opposite trend. A few weeks ago, a rocket barrage slammed into Kabul's heavily fortified green zone, where many embassies and international firms are based, killing at least 8 civilians. Several days earlier, a suicide car bomb exploded at the western entry gate of the capital, killing at least 3 soldiers. These bouts follow weeks of violence, including an attack on Kabul University, Afghanistan's largest school, where the terrorists sprayed classrooms with bullets for hours and killed at least 35 people and wounded dozens more.
زمانی که اینا داخل شدن ما اینا رو دیدیم که اینا چند همین افراد ندیدیم چند نفر بودن که در آمدن مکمل این کسایی که محصلین بودن همین هر کس دیگرش هم میآمدن اینا رو میزدن با مرمی و حتی کسایی که میگرفتن اسمشون پیش میکردن میزدن. ما قد تعدادی از دوستای ما از دروازه دیگه از طرف برآمدیم رفتیم.
در شهر بودم کار داشتم صاحب که اینم تو آوازها رسید در پانتون کابل چی شده انتحاری شده. ضعفتاً ما رسیدیم این میگه استاد زنگ زدن به شگاه که داخل پنجایی بود چی بود گفتم شما کجا سیباشیم گفت فقط داخل دعا کن.
برادرم که راهید نام داشت از دوستای نزدیکم بود دور از دست دادم و دمی صنف بودم. امروز دیگه در بین ما نیست. این اوج وحشت است، اوج دهشت است. این کار در هیچ دینی نیست.
پیام ما برای کسایی که در جبهه مخالف هستن اینه که ما هیچ وقت متوقف نمیشیم. به هر نحوی شود، به هر قیمتی شود، به هر قیمتی که علم دانش از ما بگیره ما حاضر هستیم بپردازیم و در محیط‌های اکادمیک همچنانی که قبلا بودیم حضور یافتیم همچنان حضور میابیم و برای افغانستان آباد، افغانستان آزاد ما کار می‌کنیم.
Normally blamed for such attacks in Afghanistan, the Taliban promptly denied they took part in the assaults, perhaps because they are engaged in talks with Washington and Kabul to help end the US military presence in Afghanistan. In almost all cases, the offshoot of ISIL Takfiri terrorist group in Afghanistan, also known as Daesh Khorasan or ISIL-K, claimed responsibility for the attacks.
Late in October, Daesh also claimed a brutal assault on a tutoring center in the capital's mostly Shia neighborhood of Dasht-e-Barchi that killed at least 24 students and wounded more than 100 others. Last year, a bomb outside of the Kabul's university's gates killed 8 people, and in 2016, gunmen killed 13 in the American University in Kabul. Schools are among the most targeted places for the Daeshis, both physically and intellectually.
Loyalists to the Daesh in Afghanistan are actively recruiting or passively brainwashing children and youngsters in schools and universities all across Afghanistan, including Kabul University as well as Nangarhar University in eastern Afghanistan. When Daesh gains control over a village or town, they put their men on important roles, such as teachers and mosque imams. This way they start teaching their Salafi ideology or Takfiri version of jihadism since early age. Afghanistan ISIL, with over 100 claimed attacks since 2015, is active in the border region of eastern Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, but its area of operations also includes Tajikistan and India. ISIL announced the group's formation in January 2015 and appointed former Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan militant Hafiz Saeed Khan as its leader, with former Afghan Taliban commander Abdul Rauf Aliza as deputy. Both are dead now. The leader of the Daesh Khorasan, Abdullah Oroksai, also known as Aslam Farouqi, was captured in April 2020. Then Shahab al-Muhajir was appointed as the new chief, and many suspect that he arranged the Jalalabad prison break or Kabul University and Green Zone attacks to signal an increased operational tempo for the group moving forward.
Now, for more analysis, we are joined by Ms. Medea Benjamin. She's the co-founder of Code Pink and the author of the book Drone Warfare: Killing by Remote Control. Ms. Benjamin, welcome to the subcontinent. So, how do you evaluate the US war in Afghanistan? What do you think the military presence have brought to the country and the region?
You can't say anything, but this has been a disaster for almost 20 years now. The country is as poor as it was before. Countless Afghans have died, millions have been wounded and displaced, thousands of US soldiers have been killed, as well as soldiers from other NATO countries. The country is the #1 producer of opium. The Taliban controls 40% of the territory. Any way that you look at it, it has been disastrous.
All right, so you think that it has brought complete disaster. How do you think the Afghan people feel about this?
The Afghan people are exhausted from decades of war. First 10 years during the time of the Soviet Union, and then all of this time, they just want peace. I think many of them fear the Taliban coming in and taking over again, but they also understand that unless foreign troops leave, there will be no possibility of peace. It's a vicious circle. The Taliban, who are Afghans, say as long as there is a foreign presence, they will continue to fight. So as long as the US stays there, it will mean war. So I think the Afghan people want and deserve peace, which means that foreign troops, all foreign troops, must leave their country.
Okay, Ms. Benjamin, you're saying that the people are exhausted from the decades of foreign interference and the wars that have been going on. Ms. Benjamin, let's just take a look at how the global media has covered this issue, and then we can continue with the question and answer session.
Daesh or ISIL is seen by many experts as one of the primary spoilers for any future peace in Afghanistan. The extremist group, though militarily contained in Afghanistan's east, has still managed to conduct attacks in Kabul with small cells that often coordinate on encrypted messaging applications. The group has often attacked Shiite places of worship and neighborhoods. At least 163 civilians have been killed across the country in November, according to data compiled by the New York Times. The attack on the university has caused anger, with demonstrators demanding a boycott of peace talks currently being held between the Afghan government leadership and the Taliban in the Qatari capital Doha. Violent attacks in Afghanistan have surged by 50% in the 3 months to the end of September, when compared with the previous quarter since the Taliban launched the Doha talks, the US Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, said in a report on Thursday. For the Afghan people, the ability of the ISIL to survive, despite concerted efforts by Kabul and its Western allies, presents another dangerous challenge. Just as the government is inching closer to intra-Afghan talks that could pave the way for peace with the Taliban, another group is showing itself to be even more potent and dangerous. And unlike the Taliban, who claim to be fighting a foreign occupation, very little is known about the actual goals of Daesh in the country.
Welcome back, Ms. Benjamin. So you earlier said that the foreign interference has to end, and so you say it would be more secure and stable if the foreign forces, including the Americans, leave the country, wouldn't it?
It might be more unstable for a short time, but in the long term, it would be more stable. You have a very corrupt Afghan government, and much of the corruption comes from the billions of dollars coming in from the United States. The Afghan people are very angry at all the corruption, but the corruption won't stop until the US leaves. The military contractors who made so much money from the US government, the American taxpayers who have lost so much money. There is nothing safe and secure about Afghanistan under US occupation. So yes, the only possibility to end the fighting, the deaths, the corruption, the constant displacement of people is for the US to leave. Now, there are forces within the United States that want to keep these wars going. There are companies that make money from this. There are people in the military who get advancements from this. There's all kinds of reasons to keep the war machine. But for the Afghan people, the American people, and the world community, this war must end. And the only way it will end is to have foreign occupying forces leave the country.
Ms. Benjamin, thank you so much for being with us on our show, and it was nice having you here. Viewers, let's see how people have reacted on social media, and we can move forward. Thank you.
Lisa Karkar believes the reason of bombing educational institutions is that the way of defeating terrorism is through education. Corey opined ISIS has been changed to a front-burner issue in which enemies like the Taliban and the Afghan government may even work together to vanquish it. The author points to the decline of the US military power in the region and the casualties suffered in the war, especially after the rise of ISIS. Ali believes the main obstacle to Afghanistan's progress is firstly the US anti-Soviet policies, including funding the extremists, and secondly, its invasion of Afghanistan.
On 26th of July 2020, a United Nations report stated that even though the ISIL branch in Afghanistan has suffered severe reverses in its former Afghan strongholds of Nangarhar and Kunar provinces, it was too soon to discount it as a threat. And although in territorial retreat, Daesh Khorasan remains capable of carrying out high-profile attacks across the country. People, especially the youth, fear that such attacks targeting educational or other civilian places will continue to take place, believing that the terrorists know the younger generation has the capability to change the country for the better.
The United States and its interventions seem to be among the forces behind the rise of Daesh Takfirist, as they are emboldened by US open talks with Taliban and Washington's move to release thousands of terrorists from prison as part of their deal. The US-Taliban talks in Qatar were meant to stop the violence in the country, but the bloodshed has been relentless as more terrorists are being recruited. The US failing strategy for leaving the country is something Daesh is counting on. Washington has brokered a power-sharing deal between the Afghan government and Taliban. The group explicitly renounces al-Qaeda now, but it is the same Taliban that provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda as it planned the 9/11 attacks that ignited 2 decades of war. This means the US is relying on the Taliban as a cornerstone of its counter-terrorism strategy and its fighting partner against Daesh and al-Qaeda. According to CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie, the US has supported the Taliban in its bloody fight against ISIL in the province of Nangarhar, trusting that Taliban can compress and crush their presence on the ground again. However, Afghan officials have long claimed that elements of the two groups have overlapped, at times sharing networks and resources for urban attacks, as was the case for the mastermind of the Kabul University attack.
Unlike the Taliban, whose main focus was Afghanistan, Daesh has a more global outlook and seeks to resurrect a form of a global caliphate. Following a Salafi ideology based on a skewed interpretation of the Islamic theology, Daesh sanctions the use of unrestricted violence. How much Daesh can expand its terrorist operations following the US military pullout is to be determined. But currently, the Global Terrorism Index ranks the group among the top 4 most lethal terrorist organizations in the world.
As the US and Taliban and Afghan authorities are moving closer to a final accord, the Daesh upsurge in Afghanistan is picking up momentum. The Takfiri group has called on all its followers to renew their allegiances and is also set to absorb thousands of Taliban members who wish to continue to fight for reasons of ideology, employment, profit and tribal enmity. There are some 20 other terrorist groups of various nationalities that have been battling Afghan and US coalition forces beside the Taliban for years. None of them are anyhow included in the deal with the US. Daesh Khorasan has already established ties with most of these groups, and fostering such alliances would only accelerate once the deal is finalized. Daesh Khorasan has already established ties with most of these groups, and fostering such alliances would only accelerate once the deal is finalized. Daesh is building up its power with patience and persistence to set the stage for a Takfiri takeover, while uncertainties about the future of the country's security following the withdrawal of US troops are further bogging down Afghanistan in a quagmire of interlocking forces.
Viewers, now it's time to bring in our next guest, Mr. Tim Anderson. He's the director of the Center for Hegemonic Studies. Mr. Anderson, welcome to the show. So, what are the reasons behind the increasing Takfiri terrorist attacks in Afghanistan?
I think there's 2 reasons. One is that the US, when it withdraws, and it will withdraw, wants to maintain some measure of instability in the country and in that part of the region, so that there is not a re-establishment of a stable, independent state there, which runs contrary to their plans. It's also important to remember, I think, that Afghanistan is one of the countries that surrounds Iran. So to have assets in the form of Takfiri terrorists on the borders of Iran, on both sides of the borders of Iran, surrounding it, is something that the US wants to try and keep a presence and a pressure on Iran to try and contain the influence of Iran in the region. They have been relocating these groups from Syria and Iraq as they were defeated various times, in at least relocating the commanders, those with experience, that is to say those with many years of experience, sometimes from Chechnya and other parts of the world, but particularly after the elimination of the groups in Iraq and Syria, they have been moving their assets across to the other side of Iran, to Afghanistan.
All right, so the US wants to maintain instability in the region and keep check on Iran at the same time. How can Afghanistan contain the Takfiri terrorism in the country, especially following the withdrawal of the US military? Of course, if it ever happens.
Well, I believe it will happen. They have been there 19 years now. I think they are going to withdraw. And as they withdraw and when they withdraw, I think that the terrorist issue will be reduced substantially. Really, these groups, as we see in Syria at the moment, they require a safe haven. They require a sponsor. Now, it may be that they are getting assistance in Afghanistan from the Saudis to some extent, but the principal safe haven, for example, in Syria is the presence of US troops, of Turkish troops and Israeli troops on Syrian soil. That's where the safe havens for all terrorist groups are there. So I think as the US withdraws from Afghanistan, that issue of groups of Daesh, or whatever they want to call themselves, in Afghanistan will be dealt with relatively quickly.
All right, you think it will happen and terrorism will reduce when it does. So before asking the next questions, let's see the media views regarding this problem.
The Afghan government alleges that the so-called Khorasan province of the self-declared caliphate, known as ISIL-K, the outfit responsible for the prison break in Jalalabad and a series of others throughout Afghanistan, is basically acting as a front group for the Taliban. They argue that the Taliban, and specifically the Haqqani network, an integral part of the Taliban's command structure, is using ISIL-K as a cutout for operations it doesn't want to be held responsible for conducting. This includes certain attacks targeting civilians, as well as operations that may appear to violate the spirit of the deal between the US and the Taliban. Select analysts worry about a potential resurgence of Daesh. Within this camp, some see it resurging as a result of organic factors, such as the history and appeal of Salafism in Kunar and Nangarhar provinces. They also warn that Afghan state practices of repression, exclusion and bribery redispose some youth, specifically those sympathetic to Salafi's ideological precepts, toward the ISIL.
Mr. Anderson, the US is in open talks with the Taliban after 2 decades of war. What is your reading of this? Doesn't this embolden or encourage other terrorist groups to establish more power?
Well, whatever you think of the Taliban, they are an indigenous group created in the circumstances of Afghanistan of the last few decades. And it's the case that the occupying powers, the invading powers, always at some stage have to talk to the resistance, to the local, to the indigenous resistance at some stage, when they can't achieve the goals of eliminating them or marginalising them completely. They haven't been able to eliminate the Taliban. The Taliban has shown extraordinary resilience, and this is not whether you agree with their ideology or their approach or anything, but they have maintained an incredible resistance within their own country. And the US is trying to find some way to extract itself there. Preferably, they would prefer to leave a destabilised country with pockets of Daesh in there, for example, because Afghanistan is part of a region which the US is very reluctant to give up. But eventually, they will have to leave, and they will have to leave through talks or leave with their tails between their legs. And so I think they have been looking for some opportunities to withdraw and save some sort of face and pretend that they had not been an illegal occupying power brutalising and slaughtering the people of Afghanistan for the last 2 decades. If they can do that with some sort of agreement, then I think they might prefer to do that. But it's a slow process because, as we've seen in all the other parts of the region, even when the US suffers a defeat, it doesn't really know how to accept losses very well. It's a bitter pill, and they are constantly looking for some sort of opportunity to withdraw and pretend that they had not been the terrible, destabilising, brutalising force that they actually are.
All right, either talks or tail between the legs. Fair enough. Viewers, let's see how the people have reacted on social media and cyberspace. And thank you so much, Mr. Anderson, for being with us on our show. Please stay with us.
In this video provided by Sputnik, Afghans speak out on the ISIS militants and their behavior towards the people. Let's go watch parts of it.
خودشان جنگ میکنه، یک داره میکشه، یک داره قطع شمشیر میزنه، چی میکنه، ما را میگه خونه نبراین، دما او بتین، دما نون بتین، دما او را پخته کرده بتین، دما ایره همین ما را تو کرده بود که دبینی رسانده بود. تاییدستی که بیدار شدیم، ما شو بود که ما گرفتیم.
سیاسرای مردم در هر کنج کنار گشتگی است. مال مردم برد، نفر مردم برد، دیقان مردم برد کشت، بچه‌ش برد کشت. دولت کدوم یکیش که خبر گرفت که چی شد چیز نشد. هر کس امنیت خودش گرفت اگه نگرفت دولت که امنیت نمیگیره کسی را.
And that was our episode covering the issue of the presence of ISIS in Afghanistan and its challenges. To watch bits of our episode and more updates, follow us on our social media platforms and make sure to give us feedback about what you think. We'll meet the same time, same day next week. Thanks for watching.